Muy buenas tardes. Primero que nada quisiera yo agradecer la hospitalidad de la Feria Internacional del Libro Universitario, que hasta donde entiendo es la primera vez que tiene lugar en este recinto, que esperamos se caliente académicamente más. Y yo quisiera también agradecer a nombre del Colegio Nacional y a nombre propio el hecho de que podamos colaborar de una manera tan espléndida con una institución de la cual muchos estamos asociados, que es la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Cuando el director de la feria, que es el maestro Joaquín Díez Canedo, que es un amigo de hace muchísimos años, de una familia, de una genealogía muy asociada con la cultura en México y en particular con los libros, me propuso por qué no hacer un diálogo que tuviera que ver con algún personaje de ciencia y que fuera un diálogo muy vivo. Desde luego que pensé de inmediato en el caso de la doctora Emma Darwin, que es una amiga de hace muchos años y a quien de una forma u otra estoy seguro que ustedes pueden ubicar rápidamente en términos intelectuales, en términos científicos y en términos genealógicos. Debo decir que antes de conocer a Emma, conocí a su tío, a Sir Richard Darwin Keynes, un fisiólogo absolutamente excepcional, y ya el nombre de Darwin asociado con Keynes les muestra a ustedes que se está moviendo uno de inmediato en un círculo de personajes que han hecho contribuciones absolutamente esenciales a muchas partes de la cultura. De allí que haya surgido la idea de ver cómo podíamos conversar sobre afectos y desafectos, efectos de ser un Darwin, pero además ser de una familia que ha producido gentes muy distinguidas. Yo quisiera decir que en modo alguno esta conversación pretende despersonalizar a mi amiga, la doctora Emma Darwin, como una descendiente de quien es. Sin embargo, aunque es inevitable que esto surja durante la conversación, yo sí quisiera comenzar diciendo que es una novelista muy distinguida. El primer libro que yo leí de ella es The Mathematics of Love. I don't think it has been translated.
Into Spanish.
Into Spanish.
Yes, but it was translated as Arithmetica.
Okay.
Which, if you've read the book, is slightly annoying.
To put it mildly. Yeah, to put it mildly. Ella tiene varios libros, tiene uno ahora, acaba de terminar un libro que le da título a la charla que vamos a tener mañana con ella en el Colegio Nacional. Esta no es un texto sobre la familia Darwin. De manera que yo quisiera, si me lo permiten, ya lo platicamos, comenzar un poco platicando de sus libros, y para que haya una introducción, ella va a leer un texto que preparó para esta ocasión y después platicamos de sus libros y de manera natural derivaremos hacia el peso, el significado de crecer en una familia que ha contribuido a la cultura en muchos aspectos, en el caso no solo de Inglaterra, sino de todo el mundo. So Emma, if you please, if you want to proceed reading
With a bit of this?
Yeah.
Yes.
Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine. I'll just have to explain a little bit about the people in it. Thank you for inviting me here. It's great to be here and to see so many people. Thank you to Antonio. I spent 3 years writing a novel, which I called Black Shadow and Bone, I started trying to write a novel about my family because I am a novelist, that's what I do, and that's how I understand things, and that's how I try to express them. And also I knew it would sell. And I found in Charles Darwin's grandchildren, which is my grandfather's generation, artists, writers, also scientists. My grandfather was a physicist. He's Sir Charles Darwin, just to confuse things. He has the same name. And to find a way in, I invented a character, an imagined character who did not exist, called Imogen. And I imagined that she had grown up with these real people. It was a way of looking at my family from the outside, which made it easier for me to write. But I could not make this novel work. And finally I gave up. I threw the family out of the novel and wrote it all fiction, and I started trying to find a non-fiction way to write about my family because I was interested. Everyone else is interested, and I am interested. I'm not a historian, but I nearly was, and I'm interested in how the family works and in the way creative thinking and science and arts travel down through the family tree. And eventually I realized that the way for me to write about creativity in my family was to look at it through the lens of my own creative failure in failing to write a novel about them. So the book I wrote, it's best described as life writing or creative nonfiction. I don't know if you have that category here, creative nonfiction. And I called it, This is not a book about Charles Darwin, because it's actually about everybody else. But of course, none of them would ever get written about if it wasn't for him. So he's a kind of hole in the middle. And so to give you an idea of the difficulties and the challenges that I met, I'm just going to read a very short piece from this creative nonfiction. This is not a book about Charles Darwin. It does have some short extracts from the novel, which I got out from under the bed, and to give a flavor of it. And this is from the point in the story of my failing to write the novel, where I've had feedback that the novel is really boring. It was too. In some strange way, I had felt all along that these lives still belonged to their owners and were not mine to mess with. Too often I had pulled my punches. There was so much that I had skimped or avoided or smudged altogether. I'd been a little braver in the matter of my great-aunt Gwen Ravera and her husband Jakes. They were both artists, and they had a great friend, Jean Marchand, who was also an artist. This is all in the 1920s in the south of France. Drawing yet again on Francis Spaulding's Life of Gwen Ravera, I had slipped in that during those years of living in Vence, when Jakes was dying of multiple sclerosis, Gwen and Marchand had fallen passionately in love. To this day, I feel that there must be a novel somewhere in that, even if it's not one I can write. But when I came to Jakes' appalling death, I took refuge in writing it as memory. And this is a little section from the novel. And the novel is told in third person, but it's seen through Imogen, my invented character's eyes. So this is her memory. Back then, Jakes was dying day by day and nerve by nerve, unable by then to move, to eat, everything gone except pain and terror, and still the last shards of his intelligence. That, it seemed, no disease could quite paralyze. Gwen could do nothing but look after him with as much patience as possible, which was sometimes very little, because sometimes he was so horrible. It was perverted somehow, an inversion of everything human, to say that the best hope was that Jakes wouldn't live much longer. But it was true. And so Nora said it because she was a biologist and incapable of not stating a truth, and Imogen had to agree. Gwen had said it too, and more, after one particularly dreadful day when Jakes was ill and in the kind of agony that only the paralyzed know, and begging to be allowed, to be helped, to die. What purpose is served by allowing him to live, Gwen said, when his life is like this and he doesn't even want it? Why shouldn't we be allowed to die when we choose? And why can't I help him? He can do nothing for anyone, least of all himself. You wouldn't let a dog suffer like this. It can't come soon enough if you think sensibly about it. After that illness, Jakes had clawed back some peace and pleasure for a little while, being read to and thinking and dictating letters to friends, but not for long. And in a way, they'd done years of mourning already with his illness. And Imogen had come back from Copenhagen and was hiding in Cambridge, stunned and miserable at Klaus going back to his wife. But she hurried to Vence, and Jakes died a week later. After that nightmare, after the days she could hardly think of without feeling suffocated, choking, drowning, after that, Gwen was quite calm, and the girls too. Jakes had died long ago, their demeanour seemed to say. His physical death was just the coda, the full stop, the end piece. So that was a section from the novel, and then it goes back to the book about trying to write the novel. What I'm perfectly willing to tell here, but couldn't bring myself to show in a fully dramatised scene in the novel, was what Gwen later confessed to Margaret, her sister. That when their useless doctor took one look at Jakes and ran away, Gwen seized a pillow and ended the horror. This is the sort of thing that normally makes me rub my writerly hands with glee. Years before, when I first read Spaulding's account, I'd been working on the first version of my novel, A Secret Alchemy, and I promptly put euthanasia by pillow into that novel, in all its full physical and emotional glory or hideousness. Why had I not been willing to write such things for Gwen and Imogen in Black Shadow and Bone? I reviewed all the apparently good decisions that had added up to a novel which so didn't work. There were so many places where, when the question, what should happen next, had come up, I had looked for the interesting, subtle, likely, original path. But storytelling, fundamentally, isn't a subtle business, nor is it about originality. A story can only afford to have those virtues when they don't undermine the storyteller's true and vulgar business, earning food and a place by the fire by understanding the hearer's mental and emotional world and constructing an imagined reality that the hearer positively wants to be gripped by. My argument to myself that certain paths were subtle, interesting, likely, or original was usually true, but it was also a rationalization. It was partly that writing and selling a book about one of my cousins, Rafe Vaughan Williams, having sex, or my great-aunt killing her husband seemed, yes, vulgar, prurient, sensationalist. But it was also about me. After 3 years of failing to make this novel work, life inside my writing was short on confidence and long on self-doubt, while for various reasons life outside my writing was also being complicated and at times painful. Working on Black Shadow and Bone was in many ways a refuge from these things. But the act of trying to write well will always force your writing self into connecting with the rest of your emotional circuitry. And my circuitry was very tired and a bit broken. In making decisions about the novel, I had unconsciously but consistently chosen the easier paths. But if one necessary form of writerly courage is being willing to kill your darlings, then another is being willing to give birth to monsters. Time and again, my courage had failed me, which was why the novel didn't work.
But I think it's quite moving. I think it's quite moving because the English have a reputation for being very private people, and I think it's a very deserved reputation. And you're exposing, in a mixture of fiction and reality, the inner lives of people that are very dear to you, even if they belong to previous generations.
Yes. And I think that was part of the problem. Things that I would cheerfully write about fictional characters, I really couldn't. There was a moment quite late in my working on the novel when there was a big Andrew Huxley.
Oh, yeah.
He died, and there was a big. He was a physiologist, and there was a big family party out at Grantchester after the funeral, but a sort of memorial lunch, and anybody who felt like going could go. And at one point, my sister said, "Oh, there's Horace Barlow, who was one of the few remaining of my." Oh golly, I'm going to get this wrong now. Anyway, he was in the novel. He was the only person technically still living. He's about 97 or something. And he was in the novel. I'd put him in as a baby, just in one little scene, hardly mentioned. And she said, do let me introduce you to Horace. You've never met him, have you? And I couldn't. I just couldn't. I couldn't march up to him and say, hello, I've just put you in my novel. But more seriously, she was saying, he might know things that would be useful. And I thought, but if he knows things that don't fit with what I'm doing, I will have to change what I'm doing. He has more authority than me about these events. But the reason I'm a novelist is that in a novel, I am the only authority.
Absolutely.
I am the empress. Yes. And also, I can choose to reveal or not reveal what I choose. I am in complete control. That's why also I'm not a playwright, no actors going. And it was a mixture of not knowing what to say to him. I really felt physically quite strange at the thought of it. And luckily, my sister knew about the book, and she looked at my face. She said, "All right, not there." but it was something to do with having the prospect of having to cede authority. And this is also why I wrote. This is not a book about Charles Darwin, as I did as creative writing, as creative life writing, saying, I may not remember this right. This is how I remember it. I've changed things. I've moved things around. The narrative arc that I've given it is not really what you would see if I'd kept a diary. I've moved things around to make a story, which I couldn't do if it was proper history or proper biography.
What you're describing brings to my mind immediately an exhibition that took place a number of years ago about Frida Kahlo, who was not a very private person, to put it mildly again.
I was at the Casa Azul.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, you know how it was. And I remember that in the second floor of the Palacio de Bellas Artes, they had decided to hang up letters, very private letters, about Frida Kahlo, so you could actually walk through them and see them. And I never had the strength to read them because I feel I was violating the intimacy of things that were not meant to be seen by others.
Yes.
And I suppose it was an equivalent feeling that you had.
It was a bit. I mean, early on I made a rule for myself that I would only use published sources, because then I could feel that the owners of those letters, or the people who had been interviewed, they had agreed that this stuff was going to be published, and therefore it was not a violation if I then used it. And most of the detail in that. Some of the detail in that little section of the novel that I read just now came from Frances Spalding, who's an art historian. She wrote a biography of Gwen. And also when Jakes was very, very ill, they were friends with Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Bell and all the Bloomsburys. And when Jakes was...
Sorry, again, this extraordinary circle of very distinct...
They were very distant cousins of Virginia and Vanessa as well. And Virginia Woolf was a funny creature and not always easy to get on with, and she wasn't always nice about Gwen, who was very sort of straightforward and forthright and very Darwin in that way, I think. But when Jakes was dying and he took forever, it was awful. And multiple sclerosis was not well understood, so they also didn't have what they have now to make it a bit easier. But Virginia Woolf started writing to Jakes. And Jakes couldn't write, but he would dictate to Gwen what he wanted to say. And so we have a whole batch of letters which my cousin William Pryor has edited and published. So the stuff about of where Gwen says, why aren't I allowed to kill him? He wants me to. Is out of those letters. And in some ways it's a very rich source, but also I felt that's their stuff. It's theirs. Toni Morrison, the novelist Toni Morrison, writing Beloved, which is based on the true Margaret Garner story, but she does fictionalize it. She doesn't use those names, and she changes it around. And she says, I do think that writing fiction using real lives has ethical implications. People do have a sort of copyright in their own life, and it's tricky. Can you borrow it or not? And I'm not quite sure I agree. I have my novel, A Secret Alchemy, is about real people. But they're nice and dead in the 15th century. They're not. I don't feel quite so worried about writing about them. But it's also this question of authority. And they all wrote about each other. There are all those letters. Where's the space for me? I'm just joining the dots.
Writing about the family, your family, in that way, reminds me immediately of two very important books. On the one hand, 100 Years of Solitude by Garcia Marquez, which is, of course, a fictional history of family history, and The Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann, which my father once said that it seemed to be like Garcia Marquez was writing a sort of tropical Buddenbrooks in a way, which I think was a nice way of defining it. And of course, in the case of Garcia Marquez, you have this possibility of making it very, very fantastic. But we know, for instance, now that Remedios la Bella, Remedios the Beautiful, did exist, and she ran away with a boyfriend, and so the family couldn't cope with the shame, and she was transformed into someone that went into heaven because it was beautiful. Yeah. Now, you there have the right, the possibility of the plasticity of the family history, and to cope with it. In the case of the Darwin family, in the case of the Westwood family, and all those extensions, the Keynes, the Woolses, and so on.
Yes, the Galtons, yes.
That's right. It's a very well-known family. It's a very well-known circle. And I wonder how much you feel pressed by the other descendants of the family.
I think it was just a little in the back of my head that I didn't tell anyone what I was doing apart from my sisters. Partly because I didn't want anyone to tell me I couldn't. But actually, if they told me I couldn't, I might have said, well, I don't care. But equally, or helpfully give me information that I didn't want. But I think there are also other issues. One is, bless them, most of them are really boring. They're sensible, kind, reasonably progressive. They're nice to children and animals. They tend to be good husbands and wives. They don't go off the rails. They don't do anything interesting. They don't run out of money. They don't spend lots of money. They look after their money very well. They're really dull. And most of them are, I don't know if people know, if you read about Charles Darwin, apart from the fact that he was an amazing thinker, he was just a really nice man. And so, as novelists, we like things to be terrible, or strange or whatever, and they're not. I think the other trouble is they all write letters. If you Google the Darwin Letters Project in Cambridge, it takes up about 6 libraries. They all write about each other. They write about themselves, they write about each other. And there's the thing you find, I'm sure any historians in the room will know this, is that when people wrote letters, they said who the letter should be sent on for. If you were abroad, you'd write a long letter and send, and it would get sent around the family. And so everybody would, a bit like, the reply all kind of emails and that sort of thing. And so everybody knew everybody's business. And again, if they're all writing about what they think and what they feel and what they're going to do next and what they think about what happened last week and all the rest of it, I don't have a job,
And I should just say something when talking about one of the characters in your book, and that I think immediately struck a chord in everyone in the room, because you say he reacted in a very Darwin's way.
Oh, yes.
So do you identify certain family traits? If one reads Darwin's autobiography, and if one reads a little bit about his immediate descendants, first of all, it's very surprising that in the children of Charles Darwin, none of them were artists. None of them were concerned about art. And then there was an explosion.
And then there's an explosion. Well, Gwen, again, because Gwen's memoir period piece, which is it's probably the best writing from within the family about. She was an artist, quite distinguished in her field, which was wood engraving, and she says of Charles Darwin's 5 sons, they none of them. She calls them benevolently Philistine. They would have said they knew nothing about art. They didn't know anything about music. They said they knew nothing about literature. They all liked reading and they all liked music. And they didn't care at all what anything looked like. She said if they needed to buy a new armchair, first of all, they'd think whether they could afford it. They had enough money. Second, whether it was comfortable and would wear well. And then way down the line, whether they actually liked how it looked or anything like that. But, she says, but in their science, they were like artists. They had the same craftsmanship, the same I'm not going to quote it properly now, the same infinite patience and care and observation. And I think that actually was when I started thinking about the family, that was my way in, was to realize that I think it's that observation that comes out. And actually, one of my cousins in my generation is a distinguished British poet called Ruth Padell, and her grandmother, who was therefore a grandchild of Charles, was a biologist. And Ruth Padell took her grandmother to a poetry reading for the first time, and her grandmother came out and said, "I see the point of poets now, they notice things." And it was about observation, which, as we know, it's one of the things poetry does best, is that. And of course, it's exactly what someone's doing when they're looking down a microscope or anything. They're watching and watching and watching and waiting to understand what this is all really about. I think Charles is, I think that, if you want to think of it as genetics, things skip generations. Of course, the Wedgwood side was full of, very strong creative side. And that shows up, and there are writers all the way along. One of the things I find quite interesting in terms of reception history is the way that Darwin is more and more considered as a writer. He's considered in literary terms by people like Gillian Beer and so on, and not just for the science that he does, but as a cultural phenomenon, if you like.
Well, the diary of his travels is an extraordinary book. It's a book that everybody should be reading at 15 or 16 years old. The liveliness of the writing, the accuracy of the description, and those lines, they are really like golden threads about the beautiful señoritas in Peru, or his relationship with the gauchos. It's a travel book that reminds me quite easily of people like Tolstoy when he travels to the land he owned and so on. He was quite an extraordinary
And don't
writer.
forget that he loved fiction. He read fiction, or Emma read it to him as his relaxation. He loved Jane Austen, and that was, at the end of a hard day's science, he'd put his feet up and read a nice romance or something like that. But I think the writing does come through. Gwen writes beautifully, and that comes through. And that reminds me, because there's a Wedgwood, can't quite remember how the generations fit, but he's a sort of. Yes, he decided, he spent 5 years traveling the Mediterranean. In the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, he went on a sort of long gap year. And actually, it's really quite dull. But his observation is terrific. In the sense that he is very interested in that side of things. And there's a moment, they sailed round Spain, through Gibraltar, and then all the way to the far side of the Mediterranean.
To Istanbul?
Istanbul and all around there, all in the middle of things, and every now and then they'd see a French bit of the Navy and have to go the other way because we were at war with them. But and he'd hitch a lift on a Royal Navy ship every now and again, and it was quite dangerous. He started out in a party of 5, and he was the only one who came back alive. Everybody else died. And they went through somewhere where there'd been a forest fire, and his observations of how the animals had died and all that sort of thing is very acute. But he doesn't have Darwin's sense of, story almost, of creating, imaginatively recreating what he's seeing. So it didn't make a novel. He wasn't interesting enough.
Which brings me to one point that I'm sure everybody is very keen about hearing about, the weight of being a descendant of Charles Darwin, surrounded by all these extremely creative people. Did you ever feel pressed or even by yourself of becoming a scientist? One of your siblings is a mathematician, the other one is a molecular biologist.
We all moved around. My older sister, she actually read English at Cambridge.
Okay.
And she did a maths, a PGC, a teaching, a postgraduate teaching qualification. She found one university in America that would let her do it without a first degree in maths.
Which is very unusual.
Yeah, well, it was also because in those days we do quite few subjects at 18, so you only have 4, and 2 of those were maths. So she'd done a lot of the USA undergraduate equivalent. And then she did a maths PhD, and she's now a maths lecturer. And my younger sister did natural sciences at Cambridge, but she then trained as an opera singer, and her PhD is in musicology. So she really straddles the, I'm really boring. I only went from drama to creative writing, no distance at all. I think my father was the only non-scientist of he and his brothers. My grandfather, another Charles, was a physicist. And of the 5, my Aunt Cicely was a crystallographer, though she's now a landscape architect. Well, she's very old now. My Uncle George was a a computer engineer electronic engineer in the 50s. I said punched cards, and he said, oh, long before punched cards. One of my uncles was a biologist, and I think being another biologist called Darwin is tough. But he was at London University, and the last one was a civil engineer and built oil refineries and that sort of stuff. But my father was a lawyer. He read classics at Cambridge and then switched to law, and then he went into the Foreign Office. And my mother was an English teacher. So actually, I think we got a kind of a double dose of language. Because, of course, for lawyers, exactly what words mean is absolutely everything. And so, and most of the conversations at the dinner table were about that. And my father's hobby was etymology.
Okay.
He collected etymological dictionaries. This is really obscure. So I don't know any Spanish, but I know how Spanish gets to be how Spanish is, if you see what I mean.
But then, excuse me, but
so
etymology can be a very quantitative field.
Oh, it can.
Absolutely.
Yes, it can be. I think my father said the trouble was he could never be bothered to learn the vocabulary, but it was the mechanism of how languages evolve and change. I mean, one thing that not a lot of people know is that one of Charles Darwin's great friends and cousins was a Wedgwood, because they all are, and because I've been talking about other things, I'm having a blank. Hensley Wedgwood, who was Emma's brother, and therefore Charles's cousin, and they lived almost next door to each other in London. And Hensley was the first really serious scientific etymologist, and he published the first big etymological dictionary. Big is the word, it's about that thick. And it has a long sort of first section which is laying out his principles of etymology, and it was published a few years before The Origin of Species. So they're sitting two houses apart, talking about evolution in their in two different fields, and I'm sure, talking about it over dinner. I didn't actually know that while my father was alive. I just thought it was, he liked languages and it was a hobby, and I hadn't realized that it had come down through the generations that way. But yeah, so words were our stuff. I thought I was going to be a historian from the age of 6, and it was only doing it at between 16 and 18. History had got through. We had really good history teachers who were very up to speed with modern history, which, as being taught in the 1970s to me, was very quantitative. History after the Second World War became extremely, she says nervously, looking at the historians in the room. But it had a phase of, I think it was reacting from the Victorian, the 19th century thing of the stories of great men and high deeds and all the rest of it. And it became very scientific.
But it's also the influence of the Marxist, people in Cambridge. It's a very obvious influence.
Yes, and so what I'd loved as a child about history, which was not just the famous people, but also the ordinary people, social history, but the good stories, and that had become really, and so I thought, I know people need to do this and analyze grain price indexes and stuff, but it's not me. So I wanted to be an actor at that stage, so I went to do drama, which is actually a terrific training for a novelist. Better than English literature in lots of ways, actually.
But nevertheless, the titles of your two books, well, actually the third, if we also consider the third one, if you consider this is not a book about Charles Darwin, The Mathematics of Love and The Secret Alchemy.
Yes.
Alchemy was once a science.
Yes.
So you clearly grew up in an environment that was favoring the idea of science as part of culture.
Yes. Well, we very much grew up in a culture. There was not two cultures in the house. Mm-hmm. There was one. It was everybody was interested in everything. And you might have expertise or you might not, but everything was, I still would say I'm interested in everything for a while. And also the great admired skill was to be able to explain things. My mother's a teacher, my father as a diplomat spent a lot of his time trying to put complicated things into, things that would translate across 8 different languages. In the booth, I remember him saying that when he was giving speeches, at the United Nations or in the European Community or whatever, he would be giving his speech in English and he would listen to the French in his ear. And if the French was going a bit slowly or stumbling, then he would change what he was saying as he went, so that it would be translated. And this was all in the context of legal things where you have to be really careful what you say. So expressing things was what it was, what it was all about. He can't argue was about the worst insult you could say of anyone. Also, if someone who doesn't know when something is proved. He's not kind was bad, but he can't argue was the real insult.
We're running short of time, I'm afraid, but there are a couple of questions, very quick questions that I would like to raise for you, hoping for quick answers if possible. One of them is, you just mentioned the fact that at home, culture was everything. There was no separation between the science and the humanities, between the arts and art and science and so on. Which brings me to another point. If you look at the ancestors of Charles Darwin and Emma Wedgwood on the one hand, and if you look at the descendants, you clearly see that it's not a question about genes for geniuses. What you have is an extraordinary social mobility at a time in which the upper English classes were able, not the nobility, not those close to Windsor, no. I mean, people that were in a way self-made men, self-made women, that created an atmosphere that was extremely productive in the sense of making culture patrimony of everyone in the family.
Yes.
You will feel that's an accurate description.
I think that's true, and I think a lot of it comes from the generation of Erasmus Darwin and the Lunar Society in the Midlands, which is Erasmus Darwin. I'm not going to remember them all, but Erasmus, Josiah Wedgwood, the first Josiah, James Watt, the engineer who invented the steam engine. There's a very good book by Jenny Uglow called The Lunar Men, the men who created the Industrial Revolution, and it's pretty much like that. Joseph Priestley, the chemist, and lots of others, and also in the 18th century it hadn't become so specialized, and so when Erasmus Darwin wanted to write about, he was basically writing about evolution and about botany and the plants and everything. He wanted a popular audience. Now you'd go to YouTube or you'd try and persuade a broadcasting company, or you'd see if David Attenborough would read your script for you. Then he wrote it in poetry, because of course that's what people would enjoy reading. And it was before the big professionalization of all the different arts and all the rest of it. And I really warmed to that. And they so were interested in everything. They would meet once a month. And I think I wish there was more scope for it to happen now.
Well, I'm sure you're not the only one that yearns for those times. English have a reputation for having a dark sense of humor, as we do in Mexico as well. And a family whom I will not mention her name in public, later on we can discuss it during dinner, but she once told me that there were a number of Darwin descendants that had committed suicide, the rumor had it, because the strength of the weight of the family reputation was too strong, and others, instead of committing suicide, decided to change their names to something else. Is that true, or it's just an urban myth?
I think it's an urban myth. I can't think.
I mean, it's never too late, of course.
No, well, I could always go do that. I can't think of anyone who has committed suicide descended from Charles. I mean, there aren't that many of us. Only 3 of Charles's children had children themselves. And most of them didn't have that many. And there's 152, even my generation, which is quite a few down. I don't think any of them committed suicide. I mean, most of them have not been as famous as him, but,
But it's never too late.
It's never too late, yes. I'm still working on it and not doing very well so far, but I think, we have our depressive Tom Wedgwood, Emma's uncle, obviously, but I think that stemmed from organic disease of some sort. And we've had people who've had problems, but on the whole, they're nice and they're kind and they sort of get on with it. And I think it's the flip side of the fact that, generally speaking, we get given, even the girls these days get given a good education. There is this feeling that this feeling that anything is amenable to reason, you know, in the end. And I don't think it's true, actually. But there's a sort of feeling that it is possible to tackle anything. Nothing is a place you don't go. Does that make any sense? I think there's a confidence there which is helpful. On the other hand, you know, I can't be the first to publish a book. I can't be the first to go to university. My father's generation was the first generation of Darwins not to have a Fellow of the Royal Society since 1762. Which is, I mean, you know, it doesn't bother me because I'm not Royal Society material, but I think that's hard, you know, that's hard in a way. And it, you know, and when you have done something, even within the family, they're likely to say, oh, so-and-so's gene's showing up, you know.
Which is more than the genes to culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm afraid we have to end this wonderful conversation. I'm sure that all of you have enjoyed it. Y yo quisiera, para terminar, agradecerles a nombre de los organizadores de la Feria Internacional del Libro Universitario, que está siendo un éxito espléndido, a nombre del Colegio Nacional, agradecerle a la doctora Emma Darwin la amabilidad, la generosidad con la que aceptó estar hoy con nosotros, e invitarlos el día de mañana al Colegio Nacional en Donceles 104 a una charla que ella va a dar, aquí sin interrupciones, sobre más detalles acerca de esta historia fantástica de la familia, que como ella acaba de decir, no es una cuestión de genes, es una cuestión de atmósferas. Dicho eso, la charla de mañana es a las 6 de la tarde. Thank you so much, Emma. It was a pleasure, it was a delight. And you're a delightful interlocutor. Y muchas gracias a ustedes. Hasta luego.
Thank you.
Como estoy seguro que hay dudas o fotografías o autógrafos que les gustaría pedir, si gustan pueden platicar con la doctora Darwin aquí afuera un poco, y muchas gracias de nuevo a ustedes y a los organizadores.
Brilliant.